Thank you, Ms. Desai. Let's start with 5-minute rounds of questions, and I'll start with Ms. Wahlquist. As you know, the FCC has concluded that, and I quote, service outages and interruptions in the supply of water, gas, or electricity could, in many instances, pose significant risk to public health and safety, and the use of pre-recorded message calls could speed the dissemination of information regarding service interruptions or other potentially hazardous conditions to the public, end quote. Nonetheless, and despite receiving prior consent, a number of utilities have faced expensive litigation and potentially ruinous judgments for making just such calls. Do you agree that the Commission action on the Edison Electric Institute's and the American Gas Association's petition for declaratory ruling filed with the Commission over a year ago would help utilities avoid meritless but oftentimes costly litigation for these notices? And do you think that ruling is long overdue?
I would agree that it would be helpful to the electric companies to have that ruling. I agree that it is overdue. I am concerned, though, that it would just be one more exception that the FCC would add into the checkbox of here's a few kinds of calls we think are okay. And in the 2015 order, they listed a few, and this would just add a few more. Okay, so the electric companies can now say something about outage. And the problem is there's all of these other calls that consumers would want, that they've signed up for, that they've requested, they've asked, that businesses are afraid to make, or if they're making, they're getting sued under the TCPA. So I think that the FCC does need to rule on that order, and I don't know why it wasn't in the earlier ruling. Clearly, people need to know if there's power outages. I believe one of the petitions pointed out that people may have medical equipment at home that relies on power, and we need to be able to alert them to an outage. So I think that should be ruled on, but I think there needs to be a much bigger look across the board at calls that are legitimate calls that are generating lawsuits.
Ms. Desai, at a recent field hearing, CFPB Director Cordray said, and I quote, "Let me also take a moment to acknowledge another positive development, which is the decision some banks and credit unions have made to provide consumers with real-time information about the funds in their accounts available to be spent. They are doing this through text and email alerts, which can reduce the risk that consumers inadvertently overspend their accounts," end quote. How can banks, credit unions, and other financial institutions increase communications with their consumers if they have the threat of TCPA litigation hanging over their heads?
Well, thank you, Chairman Thune. You raise a very important point. There are all types of time-sensitive, consumer-beneficial communications, such as the example you raise, available funds to reduce the risk of overspending, but also high purchase alerts, low balance alerts. And these types of time-sensitive communications are only possible through modern technology. These communications can't be made through a rotary phone. And this is the heart of the challenge, not only for my financial institution clients, but frankly, all of my clients who engage in communications with consumers and with their customers. They are paying a significant cost for the additional risk that any time-sensitive communication they make runs the risk of being sent to a reassigned number. And that is a factor that they cannot fully control. As a result, many of my clients are choosing to decrease beneficial elective communications through cell phone or text because they know that every single one of these communications does carry that additional risk.
Mr. Lovitch, you stated the quote, "The practical impact of TCPA restrictions on the care provider community is devastating," end quote. I'm wondering if you could sort of elaborate on what that devoting so many resources to TCPA compliance means for patient care.
Thank you, Chairman. I think that's probably the most important question that I could be asked today because it does impact upon patient care, which is obviously the most important aspect of providing health care. As any other enterprise, a hospital has to make economic decisions when they are dealing with a finite pot of resources. If resources have to be dedicated to an administrative action, such as dealing with the TCPA, that requires decisions to be made with regard to staffing. If that impacts, for example, the number of nurses that are there to treat patients, it reduces the direct interaction between the nurses and the patient, the delivery of direct follow-up instructions, other instructions with regard to the patient care. There have been studies done by the Department of Health and Human Services. The Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality has found that the reduction in nursing staffing has a direct relationship to negative patient outcomes with regard to the treatment of their conditions. So the more resources that have to be dedicated to the non-use of up-to-date technology calls from that pool of talent that is not being directed to patient care. And I don't think that's something that we want to do.